welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Welcome to Syosset Library's Turn the Page podcast. My name is Jessica. Hi, how you doing? I'm here with the author of The September House, Carissa Orlando. It's not quite September while we're recording this, but I think that the book comes out in September, right?
Correct. Yes, comes out September 5th.
So this is a really creepy book, and I have a lot of thoughts about it, but before I get into mine, why don't you chat a little bit about September House and just sort of, in your mind, what encapsulates the book? What's it about?
Yeah. Well, to not go into spoilers or anything like that, the book is about our protagonist, Margaret, who 4 years prior, she and her husband, Hal, purchased their dream. Turns out to have been incredibly haunted, just the most haunted house you could ever imagine. But instead of fleeing, as most people would have done, Margaret just decides she's going to make it work. And she finds a way of living with these horrors by crafting kind of an elaborate set of rules. Her husband, however, is kind of not on board with any of that. For just over 3 years, decides he is done, and her husband decides he's done with it, and he gets out of there. And their adult daughter, Catherine, who is not aware that the house is haunted, decides to come and kind of see what happened with her dad and where he got off to. And so Margaret is now faced with it. She has to kind of keep the hauntings away from Catherine while still following kind of the rules of the house and managing everything. Everything in the house gets way worse in September. And so, of course, that's when Catherine comes to visit. So that's where we start off.
So why September? I think that's my question. Why the month of September?
Yeah, it seemed like the best month. I didn't want to do something so obvious as like October, because that's what we all consider the spooky months. But I personally like the months where things kind of start to change. So spring months and like the beginning of autumn months. And September, I think, it's a change month. Things are starting to, like, autumn is approaching. We can kind of see that like the cycle of the year is turning, and it's getting colder and potentially spookier. So that seemed like an appropriate month to have everything.
I agree, especially since, different things starting up again in September, like school. A lot of people start to have back to school nightmares. I think September is definitely kind of one of those months that I always call it the Monday of the year.
I can definitely see that, and I think a lot of my students would agree.
So, a haunted house story, haunted house stories have been done so many times, and I always love it when they're done a little bit differently. You kind of start off, what kind of house, obviously. I mean, if you're picking this book up and you don't know you're picking up a horror book, you're doing it. You're picking up a horror book. So, if you're listening to this and you are not a horror reader, maybe September House isn't for you, but September House is a horror book, and it is super, super creepy. But I liked what I like about haunted house books are that they have a foundation that they all share. And, just like in other houses, people live there, people probably died there, but it's just sort of the coming together and how those things interact that sort of make them what they are. what I liked about just sort of the writing of September House was that it kind of evoked the feeling of a much older book, like, like a Shirley Jackson type book, or, like a Haunting of Hill House type book, but it brought new things into it. So what was it about a haunted house book that, kind of started for you? Like, what's the foundation of a good haunted house book?
Hmm. That's an excellent question. That's also kind of, I probably have two different answers to different portions of that question. I love haunted house stories and movies. They're the kind of like the one horror movie where it doesn't matter how bad it is, I will watch it. That's actually true of a lot of horror movies, but I'm particularly drawn to haunted house movies. And I just, like you said, there's something so familiar about the haunted house story. It's been done 7 gajillion times, and it tends to get done in a very similar way. Family moves in, deal's too good to be true, haunted things happen, they figure it out and eventually either leave or the house gets them. I think what I love so much about haunted house stories is that the family usually brings something into the house. Like there's conflict, there's financial strain, there's maybe something in their past that they are trying to not necessarily get away from, but like pretend didn't happen and start anew. And I just appreciate how much the dynamics of the haunted house itself just brings out, has brought to the table, and how that interacts with all of that. And so I think you can kind of see in September House where maybe I was a little bit bored of, well, I'm never bored of the tropes, but I was wanting to play with the tropes in a different way. But I'm never bored of what the family brings to the house. So I think you see a lot of what the family brings with them, seen through the tropes in a new light, or a different.
Yeah, I think so too. And one thing I did like about Hal and Margaret's story was that they, when they were buying the house, like they have an adult daughter. Usually, they're bringing a kid into it as a child. There is a child in the house, a child ghost, and other ghosts as well.
Children ghosts.
Yeah, but Catherine is not a child. Is not a child, and she sort of, she comes in a little bit later to the story. She's unaware of, I guess, the pranksters, as Margaret likes to refer to them. And, she's just very concerned about finding her dad. So I think like that was something I really appreciated, especially like bringing a parent child, but adult child and parent relationship into a haunted house story. Felt very fresh. Um, in particular, had you ever considered making Catherine a much younger child, or did you always know you wanted it to be a story about an adult mother and obviously and an adult child?
No, I don't think I ever considered making Catherine younger. I think when the story originated, it was truly always going to be a story about a singular person and the house. Like it was going to be an incredibly haunted house and the person who is unbothered by all of it. And so it's Margaret, not Margaret versus house, but Margaret and house kind of the whole time. And so just from a mechanistic story perspective, anybody entering the story does need to be kind of external to that because they're not involved in the relationship between Margaret and the house. And so functionally, it just makes more sense for Catherine to be out of the house, which it makes most sense for her to be an adult, but also she has more agency as an adult. She can rightfully ask questions like, where's my dad? Why haven't you heard from him? And actually start to solve these problems a little bit more if she's an adult versus a child, where she maybe has a little bit less control over the situation.
So when you were kind of putting the ghosts together, again, and this is like playing with tropes, you have so many different personalities in this house that are dead people. Um, wh who spoke to you the loudest?
I guess that would have to be just in terms of creation. Elias weirdly he was one of the first ones I imagined. He was kind of always going to be there as just this kind of little, Elias is just this like ghostly boy who's just kind of, he hovers, but you can't get too close to him because he'll bite you. And so he was always going to be present in there. And I think after Elias, in terms of just the one that is my favorite, is Frederica, who is, I don't want to call her a maid. She's just kind of like a house lady. Usually throughout the year, she's quite helpful. She, you know, cooks dinners and things like that, even if Margaret doesn't really want her to. But as September progresses, she becomes increasingly unhelpful and just starts moving things around willy-nilly and breaking stuff and walking into the kitchen and turning all the burners on high and then leaving, stuff like that. And she was just so stoic and hilariously unhelpful. She was so fun.
Yeah, I liked her too, actually. You know, I liked like just like I like how the book begins with, okay, so they're looking at this house, and then suddenly it's September, and you know, you just go like right into it. Like that's another thing I really like. You know, I mean, I'm a fan of the slow burn of a haunted house, but I've got to say, I love just how we were just really sort of dropped in it. You know, you have like that stereotypical scene of the couple, they're looking at the house and they're like, oh yeah, you know, oh, this is such a good deal. And it's like, this is beautiful. This is my dream house. Like, oh yeah, well, there might be a haunting, you know, there were deaths here. And then suddenly it's just like, and it's September and the walls are bleeding, which is not a spoiler because you do get right into it. And that was just phenomenally fun to dive into a pool of blood, but just done in such like a comical way that was also scary. Yeah, you know, at what points did you kind of perceive the nuances of this house? I mean, when you move into any house that's not brand new, you know, you're not necessarily, you're moving into somebody else's space. I mean, it doesn't matter whether or not you believe in haunted houses or not. Whatever quirks the house had beforehand, when the house changes hands, you find out very quickly, like, oh, this is a thing. You know, with Margaret and Hal, it just happens to be ghosts and bleeding walls in September. But yeah, like where did the quirks, like the individual quirks of the house come from? And did you yourself ever move into a space that maybe you didn't think was haunted, but like just had these really bizarre quirks that you kind of ruminated on?
Hmm. With kind of the first part of your question, like I said, I'm a huge haunted house, particularly movie fan. And so when kind of the idea for this came about, I was just thinking I want to create the most haunted house. And this woman is just okay with it. And so it was whatever trope I could think of or whatever thing I'd seen before. Like it was getting tossed in there, like bleeding walls, screaming, dead birds, ghost children running all over the place, people spitting out flies, like just however many I could toss in. That was what was going to be a part of it because this was just going to be the most haunted house. That and so it was just how many can I possibly fit in and have Margaret have to deal with? Because there's stuff that just gets like talked in a sentence or like mentioned once, or it's just something she has to deal with, and then we're like moving on from it. Like there's a lot that she's had to deal with this. And then in terms of kind of spaces that I've lived in, I don't think, knock on wood, yet I don't think I've lived in places where it's been like haunted or things like that. I've definitely lived in my fair share of crappy apartments and crappy houses, where there was things, you know, like the air conditioning wasn't fully working, or and the last place my spouse and I lived, we had squirrels, I think, living in the walls. And so I would be kind of sitting in my writing room typing, and I could hear just scratching behind me. I'm just like, oh, I sure hope that's I hope that that's not doing too much damage. But we're out of that place now, and I'm very happy about it before the squirrels like chewed through the wall.
Yeah, I know that like I've had, I've had my own share of weird experiences, but like I guess like my nowadays my response is always to kind of figure out what the I guess real world scientific reasons for certain things would be. And I think like my most memorable one was something that happened when I was a kid, around my kid's age now, actually. And I'm still convinced that it happened, but now like part of me is like, well, I feel like it was probably part of sleep paralysis, because back when I was in third grade, I didn't know that sleep paralysis was a thing. I didn't learn about it until I was in my 20s, and I didn't realize that you could like hallucinate during sleep paralysis. So for the longest time, I was like, oh yes, absolutely, I believe in ghosts, etc., etc. And this thing happened to me when I was a kid, and then like as I got older, and I don't know if this is just sort of how our brains work. You're a teacher of psychology, so maybe you can tell me. It's like I consider myself an open-minded skeptic. Like I'm like, okay, that was definitely weird. I definitely know that that happened. This is what I saw, but maybe the circumstances surrounding it were not what I thought they were as a kid. Maybe it was a symptom of something else. So I think, I think there's like, but I think like kind of talking about, you said talk about quirky apartments and etc. And just talking about this story in general, I think like our brains process a lot of stuff. And I think the way that we perceive things is very different. And I think sometimes we haunt ourselves
Yep,
without
I would
saying too much.
believe that. I mean, yeah, I'm in mental health, and a lot of the work that we do is just to help people understand like the damage that our own brains inflict upon us, and helping people to learn that just because your brain tells you something, or just because you think something, doesn't mean that it's reality or true, or that you need to be acting on it. So I would definitely agree with that.
I really liked Margaret's voice. I liked how we had to read between the lines of her narration, how she would share certain things, but it would be like just little enough that we'd kind of wonder like, oh, well, what did she mean by that? Why did this thing happen when her child was younger, for instance? And why is she referring to this time period in a certain way, as if there was something else? And again, this is all kind of me talking around the other plot points of the book. But she was a very haunted person, and Catherine was a very haunted person. And when you bring haunted people into a haunted house, which I mean, generally, actually, it might be fun to read a haunted house story with like the most like mentally healthy people ever moving into a haunted house. And like, what is it? Like the ghosts are just doing their thing, and the people are just like, okay.
Yeah.
Right, that would be a completely different story. But what really works for me about haunted house stories, and I don't know, you being a haunted house aficionado, is that you do kind of bring two hauntings together. You bring the actual haunting in, and then you bring the internal haunting that the family is bringing to the house.
Yeah, exactly. That's what's so compelling to me about it. And maybe it's the what are they bringing to the table? What brought them here? What are they working through during the haunting?
And how is this particular house going to mess with that?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Because there's always a relationship with that haunting as well. So yeah. So September House is super. It's very cinematic also, by the way. I could like hear it was like I could like hear the things that were happening in the house while they were happening. And I don't know if you're one of these people, but like to me, September has a smell, and like I felt it, I smelled it. It really was just very it worked with all the sensory stuff when I was reading the book. So this book is super, super creepy. There's a lot of spoilers that I don't want to talk about, but absolutely. Yeah. Oh, one more thing actually I wanted to talk about was that Hal is a writer, Margaret's husband. So any particular reason you chose that career for him?
It's so opportunistic because I just needed Hal to have a job where people wouldn't be upset that he didn't come to work the next day. He pieces out at the beginning of the book. Like he's just like, I'm done with this, bye. And Catherine it's a radio silence thing, and I just need to be somewhere that like he was kind of self-employed. There might have been other ways I could have done that, but I think I just channeled my inner kind of Stephen King reader of he's gonna be a writer. And no one would miss him besides his family. So
yeah, I like that. That's good. That is very convenient. I wasn't even thinking about it in those terms, man. I was like, I had all sorts of other thoughts in my mind, but that's great. Thank you.
I mean, some choices are made for legit reasons. Some have deeper meaning, and some are just like, I just needed there was a needed to patch up. So this happened for convenient plot related reasons. So that's one of them.
Well, thank you so much. Are you going to, do you think you will write another book?
Yeah, hopefully so, God willing. I am always writing, always have things on various burners. It's just a matter of, is there someone that is willing to help me put it out in the world? And does it seem like it's an idea that is just for me, or that other people might want to read too? So hopefully you'll see something else by me.
Absolutely.
In the coming years.
Well, thank you so much. Once again, this was Jessica with Syosset Library's Turn the Page podcast. Our guest today was
Carissa Orlando, author of September House, out September 5th.
and we are going to close this chapter of Turn the Page.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.